Chapter 42 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 42 Belle Ile en Mer. At the extremity of the mole, against which the furious sea beats at the evening tide, two men, holding each other by the arm, were conversing in an animated and expansive tone, without the possibility of any other human being hearing their words, borne away as they were, one by the gusts of wind, with the white foam swept from the crests of the waves. The sun had just gone down in the vast sheet of the crimsoned ocean, like a gigantic crucible. From time to time, one of these men, turning towards the east, cast an anxious, inquiring look over the sea. The other, interrogating the features of his companion, seemed to seek for information in his looks. Then, both silent, busied with dismal thoughts, they resumed their walk. Every one has already perceived that these two men were our proscribed heroes, Porthos and Aramis, who had taken refuge in Belle Ile, since the ruin of their hopes, since the discomfiture of the colossal schemes of Monsieur d'Herblay.
"It is of no use your saying anything to the contrary, my dear Aramis," repeated Porthos, inhaling vigorously the salt breeze with which he charged his massive chest. "It is of no use, Aramis. The disappearance of all the fishing boats that went out 2 days ago is not an ordinary circumstance. There has been no storm at sea. The weather has been constantly calm, not even the lightest gale; and even if we had had a tempest, all our boats would not have foundered. I repeat, it is strange. This complete disappearance astonishes me, I tell you."
"True," murmured Aramis. "You are right, friend Porthos. It is true, there is something strange in it."
"And further,"
added Porthos, whose ideas the ascent of the Bishop of Vannes seemed to enlarge,
"and further, do you not observe that if the boats have perished, not a single plank is washed ashore?"
"I have remarked it as well as yourself."
"And do you not think it strange that the only 2 boats we had left in the whole island, and which I sent in search of the others—"
Aramis here interrupted his companion by a cry, and by so sudden a movement that Porthos stopped as if he were stupefied.
"What do you say, Porthos? What? You have sent the 2 boats?" "In search of the others. Yes, to be sure I have," replied Porthos, calmly. "Unhappy man, what have you done? Then we are indeed lost!" cried the bishop. "Lost? What did you say?" exclaimed the terrified Porthos. "How lost, Aramis? How are we lost?"
Aramis bit his lips.
"Nothing, nothing. Your pardon, I meant to say—" "What?"
"That if we were inclined, if we took a fancy to make an excursion by sea, we could not."
"Very good, and why should that vex you? A precious pleasure, ma foi! For my part, I don't regret it at all. What I regret is certainly not the more or less amusement we can find at Belle Ile. What I regret, Aramis, is Pierrefonds, Bracieux, Le Vallon, beautiful France. Here we are not in France, my dear friend. We are, I know not where. Oh, I tell you, in full sincerity of soul, and your affection will excuse my frankness, but I declare to you I am not happy at Belle Ile. No, in good truth, I am not happy."
Aramis breathed a long but stifled sigh.
"Dear friend," replied he, "that is why it is so sad a thing you have sent the 2 boats we had left in search of the boats which disappeared 2 days ago. If you had not sent them away, we would have departed." "Departed? And the orders, Aramis?" "What orders?" "Parbleu! Why, the orders you have been constantly, in and out of season, repeating to me, that we were to hold Belle Ile against the usurper. You know very well." "That is true," murmured Aramis again. "You see, then, plainly, my friend, that we could not depart, and that the sending away of the boats in search of the others cannot prove prejudicial to us in the very least."
Aramis was silent, and his vague glances, luminous as that of an albatross, hovered for a long time over the sea, interrogating space, seeking to pierce the very horizon.
"With all that, Aramis,"
continued Porthos, who adhered to his idea, and that the more closely from the bishop having apparently endorsed it,
"with all that, you give me no explanation about what can have happened to these unfortunate boats. I am assailed by cries and complaints whichever way I go. The children cry to see the desolation of the women, as if I could restore the absent husbands and fathers. What do you suppose, my friend? And how ought I to answer them?"
"Think all you like, my good Porthos, and say nothing." This reply did not satisfy Porthos at all. He turned away grumbling something in ill humor. Aramis stopped the valiant musketeer. "Do you remember," said he, in a melancholy tone, kneading the two hands of the giant between his own with affectionate cordiality, "do you remember, my friend, that in the glorious days of youth, do you remember, Porthos, when we were all strong and valiant, we and the other two, if we had then had an inclination to return to France, do you think this sheet of salt water would have stopped us?"
"Oh!" said Porthos, "but 6 leagues!"
"If you had seen me get astride of a plank, would you have remained on land, Porthos?"
"No, pardieu! No, Aramis. But nowadays, what sort of a plank should we want, my friend? I in particular."
And the Seigneur de Bracieux cast a profound glance over his colossal rotundity with a loud laugh.
"And do you mean seriously to say you are not tired of Belle Isle a little, and that you would not prefer the comforts of your dwelling, of your episcopal palace at Vannes? Come, confess."
"No," replied Aramis, without daring to look at Porthos.
"Let us stay where we are, then,"
said his friend, with a sigh, which, in spite of the efforts he made to restrain it, escaped his echoing breast.
"Let us remain, let us remain. And yet," added he, "and yet, if we seriously wished, but that decidedly, if we had a fixed idea, one firmly taken, to return to France, and there were not boats—"
"Have you remarked another thing, my friend? That is, since the disappearance of our barks, during the last 2 days' absence of fishermen, not a single small boat has landed on the shores of the isle?"
"Yes, certainly, you are right. I, too, have remarked it, and the observation was the more naturally made, for, before the last 2 fatal days, barks and shallops were as plentiful as shrimps."
"I must inquire," said Aramis, suddenly and with great agitation. "And then, if we had a raft constructed—"
"But there are some canoes, my friend. Shall I board one?"
"A canoe! A canoe! Can you think of such a thing, Porthos? A canoe to be upset in! No, no," said the bishop of Vannes, "it is not our trade to ride upon the waves. We will wait, we will wait." And Aramis continued walking about with increased agitation. Porthos, who grew tired of following all the feverish movements of his friend, Porthos, who in his faith and calmness understood nothing of the sort of exasperation which was betrayed by his companion's continual convulsive starts, Porthos stopped him.
"Let us sit down upon this rock," said he. "Place yourself there, close to me, Aramis, and I conjure you, for the last time, to explain to me in a manner I can comprehend, explain to me what we are doing here."
"Porthos," said Aramis, much embarrassed.
"I know that the false king wished to dethrone the true king. That is a fact that I understand. Well—"
"Yes," said Aramis.
I know that the false king formed the project of selling Belle Isle to the English. I understand that too." "Yes." "I know that we engineers and captains came and threw ourselves into Belle Isle to take direction of the works, and the command of 10 companies levied and paid by Monsieur Fouquet, or rather, the 10 companies of his son in law. All that is plain."
Aramis rose in a state of great impatience. He might be said to be a lion importuned by a gnat. Porthos held him by the arm.
"But what I cannot understand, what, in spite of all the efforts of my mind, and all my reflections, I cannot comprehend, and never shall comprehend, is, that instead of sending us troops, instead of sending us reinforcements of men, munitions, provisions, they leave us without boats, they leave Belle Isle without arrivals, without help. It is that instead of establishing with us a correspondence, whether by signals, or written or verbal communications, all relations with the shore are intercepted. Tell me, Aramis, answer me, or rather, before answering me, will you allow me to tell you what I have thought? Will you hear what my idea is, the plan I have conceived?"
The bishop raised his head.
"Well, Aramis," continued Porthos, "I have dreamed, I have imagined that an event has taken place in France. I dreamt of Monsieur Fouquet all the night, of lifeless fish, of broken eggs, of chambers badly furnished, meanly kept. Villainous dreams, my dear D'Herblay, very unlucky such dreams."
"Porthos, what is that yonder?" interrupted Aramis, rising suddenly, and pointing out to his friend a black spot upon the empurpled line of the water.
"A bark," said Porthos. "Yes, it is a bark. Ah, we shall have some news at last."
"There are two," cried the bishop, on discovering another mast. "Two, 3, 4."
"5," said Porthos, in his turn. "6, 7. Ah, mon Dieu, mon Dieu! It is a fleet."
"Our boats returning, probably," said Aramis, very uneasily, in spite of the assurance he affected.
"They are very large for fishing boats," observed Porthos. "And do you not remark, my friend, that they come from the Loire?"
"They come from the Loire, yes."
"And look, everybody here sees them as well as ourselves. Look, women and children are beginning to crowd the jetty."
An old fisherman passed. "Are those our barks yonder?" asked Aramis. The old man looked steadily into the eye of the horizon.
"No, monseigneur," replied he, "they are lighter boors. Boats in the king's service."
"Boats in the royal service!" replied Aramis, starting. "How do you know that?" said he.
"By the flag." "But," said Porthos, "the boat is scarcely visible. How the devil, my friend, can you distinguish the flag?"
"I see there is one," replied the old man. "Our boats, trade lighters, do not carry any. That sort of craft is generally used for transport of troops."
"Ah!"
groaned Aramis.
"Vivat!" cried Porthos. "They are sending us reinforcements, don't you think they are, Aramis?"
"Probably."
"Unless it is the English coming."
"By the Loire. That would have an evil look, Porthos, for they must have come through Paris."
"You are right. They are reinforcements, decidedly, or provisions."
Aramis leaned his head upon his hands and made no reply. Then all at once, "Porthos," said he, "have the alarm sounded."
"The alarm! Do you imagine such a thing?"
"Yes, and let the cannoneers mount their batteries, the artillerymen be at their pieces, and be particularly watchful of the coast batteries." Porthos opened his eyes to their widest extent. He looked attentively at his friend, to convince himself he was in his proper senses. "I will do it, my dear Porthos," continuing Aramis in his blandest tone.
I will go and have these orders executed myself, if you do not go, my friend." "Well, I will, instantly," said Porthos, who went to execute the orders, casting all the while looks behind him, to see if the bishop of Vannes were not deceived, and if, on recovering more rational ideas, he would not recall him. The alarm was sounded, trumpets brayed, drums rolled, the great bronze bell swung in horror from its lofty belfry. The dikes and moles were quickly filled with the curious and soldiers, matches sparkled in the hands of the artillerymen, placed behind the large cannon bedded in their stone carriages. When every man was at his post, when all the preparations for defense were made, "Permit me, Aramis, to try to comprehend," whispered Porthos timidly in Aramis's ear. "My dear friend, you will comprehend but too soon," murmured M. d'Herblay, in reply to this question of his lieutenant. "The fleet which is coming yonder, with sails unfurled, straight towards the port of Belle Isle, is a royal fleet, is it not?" "But as there are two kings in France, Porthos, to which of these two kings does this fleet belong?" "Oh! you open my eyes," replied the giant, stunned by the insinuation. And Porthos, whose eyes this reply of his friend's had at last opened, or rather thickened the bandage which covered his sight, went with his best speed to the batteries to overlook his people, and exhort every one to do his duty. In the meantime, Aramis, with his eye fixed on the horizon, saw the ships continually drawing nearer. The people and the soldiers, perched on the summits of the rocks, could distinguish the masts, then the lower sails, and at last the hulls of the lighters, bearing at the masthead the royal flag of France. It was night when one of these vessels, which had created such a sensation among the inhabitants of Belle Isle, dropped anchor within cannon shot of the place. It was soon seen, notwithstanding the darkness, that some sort of agitation reigned on board the vessel, from the side of which a skiff was lowered, of which the three rowers, bending to their oars, took the direction of the port, and in a few instants struck land at the foot of the fort. The commander jumped ashore. He had a letter in his hand, which he waved in the air, and seemed to wish to communicate with somebody. This man was soon recognized by several soldiers as one of the pilots of the island. He was the captain of one of the two barks retained by Aramis, but which Porthos, in his anxiety with regard to the fate of the fishermen who had disappeared, had sent in search of the missing boats. He asked to be conducted to M. d'Herblay. Two soldiers, at a signal from a sergeant, marched him between them and escorted him. Aramis was upon the quay. The envoy presented himself before the bishop of Vannes. The darkness was almost absolute, notwithstanding the flambeaux borne at a small distance by the soldiers who were following Aramis in his rounds. "Well, Jonathan, from whom do you come?" "Monseigneur, from those who captured me." "Who captured you?" "You know, monseigneur, we set out in search of our comrades?" "Yes, and afterwards?" "Well, monseigneur, within a short league we were captured by a chasse maree belonging to the king." "Ah!" said Aramis. "Of which king?" cried Porthos. Jonathan started. "Speak," continued the bishop. "We were captured, monseigneur, and joined to those who had been taken yesterday morning." "What was the cause of the mania for capturing you all?" said Porthos. "Monsieur, to prevent us from telling you," replied Jonathan. Porthos was again at a loss to comprehend. "And they have released you to day?" asked he. "That I might tell you that they captured us, monsieur." "Trouble upon trouble," thought honest Porthos. During this time Aramis was reflecting. "Humph!" said he. "Then I suppose it is a royal fleet blockading the coasts?" "Yes, monseigneur." "Who commands it?" "The captain of the king's musketeers." "D'Artagnan?" "D'Artagnan!" exclaimed Porthos. "I believe that is the name." "And did he give you this letter?" "Yes, monseigneur." "Bring the torches nearer." "It is his writing," said Porthos. Aramis eagerly read the following lines: "Order of the king to take Belle Isle, or to put the garrison to the sword if they resist. Order to make prisoners of all the men of the garrison. Signed, D'Artagnan, who the day before yesterday arrested Monsieur Fouquet for the purpose of his being sent to the Bastille." Aramis turned pale, and crushed the paper in his hands. "What is it?" asked Porthos. "Nothing, my friend, nothing." "Tell me, Jonathan." "Monseigneur?" "Did you speak to Monsieur d'Artagnan?" "Yes, monseigneur." "What did he say to you?" "That for ampler information he would speak with monseigneur." "Where?" "On board his own vessel." "On board his vessel?"
And Porthos repeated,
"On board his vessel."
"Monsieur le mousquetaire," continued Jonathan, "told me to take you both on board my canoe, and bring you to him."
"Let us go at once!" exclaimed Porthos. "Dear D'Artagnan!"
But Aramis stopped him.
"Are you mad?" cried he. "Who knows that it is not a snare?" "Of the other kings?" said Porthos, mysteriously. "A snare, in fact. That's what it is, my friend." "Very possibly. What is to be done, then? If D'Artagnan sends for us?" "Who assures you that D'Artagnan sends for us?"
"Well, but his writing."
"Writing is easily counterfeited. This looks counterfeited, unsteady."
"You are always right. But in the meantime we know nothing." Aramis was silent. "It is true," said the good Porthos, "we do not want to know anything." "What shall I do?" asked Jonathan. "You will return on board this captain's vessel."
"Yes, monseigneur."
"And will tell him that we beg he will himself come into the island."
"Ah! I comprehend," said Porthos.
"Yes, monseigneur," replied Jonathan. "But if the captain should refuse to come to Belle Isle?"
"If he refuses, as we have cannon, we will make use of them." "What! Against D'Artagnan?"
"If it is D'Artagnan, Porthos, he will come. Go, Jonathan, go."
"Ma foi! I no longer comprehend anything," murmured Porthos.
"I will make you comprehend it all, my dear friend. The time for it has come. Sit down upon this gun carriage, open your ears, and listen well to me."
"Oh, pardieu! I will listen, no fear of that."
"May I depart, monseigneur?" cried Jonathan.
"Yes, begone,
and bring back an answer. Allow the canoe to pass, you men there." And the canoe pushed off to regain the fleet. Aramis took Porthos by the hand, and commenced his explanations. End of chapter. Chapter 43 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 43. Explanations by Aramis. What I have to say to you, friend Porthos, will probably surprise you, but it may prove instructive.
"I like to be surprised," said Porthos, in a kindly tone. "Do not spare me, therefore, I beg. I am hardened against emotions. Don't fear, speak out."
It is difficult, Porthos, difficult, for in truth I warn you a second time, I have very strange things, very extraordinary things to tell you."
"Oh, you speak so well, my friend, that I could listen to you for days together. Speak, then, I beg. And stop, I have an idea. I will, to make your task more easy, I will, to assist you in telling me such things, question you."
"I shall be pleased at your doing so."
"What are we going to fight for, Aramis?"
"If you ask me many such questions as that, if you would render my talk the easier by interrupting my revelations thus, Porthos, you will not help me at all. So far, on the contrary, that is the very Gordian knot. But, my friend, with a man like you, good, generous, and devoted, the confession must be bravely made. I have deceived you, my worthy friend."
"You have deceived me."
"Good heavens, yes."
"Was it for my good, Aramis?"
"I thought so, Porthos. I thought so sincerely, my friend."
"Then,"
said the honest seigneur of Bracieux,
"you have rendered me a service, and I thank you for it; for if you had not deceived me, I might have deceived myself. In what, then, have you deceived me? Tell me."
"In that I was serving the usurper against whom Louis XIV. At this moment is directing his efforts."
"The usurper!"
said Porthos, scratching his head.
"That is well, I do not quite clearly comprehend."
"He is one of the two kings who are contending for the crown of France."
"Very well. Then you were serving him who is not Louis XIV.?
You have hit the matter in one word.
"It follows that?"
"It follows that we are rebels, my poor friend."
"The devil! The devil!"
cried Porthos, much disappointed. "Oh! But, dear Porthos, be calm. We shall still find means of getting out of the affair, trust me."
"It is not that which makes me uneasy," replied Porthos. "That which alone touches me is that ugly word, rebels."
"Ah, but "
"And so, according to this, the duchy that was promised me "
"It was the usurper that was to give it to you."
"And that is not the same thing, Aramis," said Porthos, majestically.
"My friend, if it had only depended upon me, you should have become a prince." Porthos began to bite his nails in a melancholy way.
"That is where you have been wrong," continued he, "in deceiving me, for that promised duchy I reckoned upon. Oh, I reckoned upon it seriously, knowing you to be a man of your word, Aramis."
"Poor Porthos! Pardon me, I implore you."
"So then,"
continued Porthos, without replying to the bishop's prayer,
"so then, it seems, I have quite fallen out with Louis XIV.?
"Oh, I will settle all that, my good friend. I will settle all that. I will take it on myself alone."
"Aramis!"
"No, no, Porthos, I conjure you, let me act. No false generosity, no inopportune devotedness. You knew nothing of my projects. You have done nothing of yourself. With me, it is different. I alone am the author of this plot. I stood in need of my inseparable companion. I called upon you, and you came to me in remembrance of our ancient device, all for one, one for all. My crime is that I was an egotist."
"Now that is a word I like," said Porthos; "and seeing that you have acted entirely for yourself, it is impossible for me to blame you. It is natural."
And upon this sublime reflection, Porthos pressed his friend's hand cordially. In presence of this ingenuous greatness of soul, Aramis felt his own littleness. It was the second time he had been compelled to bend before real superiority of heart, which is more imposing than brilliancy of mind. He replied by a mute and energetic pressure to the endearment of his friend.
"Now," said Porthos, "that we have come to an explanation, now that I am perfectly aware of our situation with respect to Louis XIV., I think, my friend, it is time to make me comprehend the political intrigue of which we are the victims. for I plainly see there is a political intrigue at the bottom of all this."
"D'Artagnan, my good Porthos, D'Artagnan is coming, and will detail it to you in all its circumstances. But, excuse me, I am deeply grieved. I am bowed down with mental anguish, and I have need of all my presence of mind, all my powers of reflection, to extricate you from the false position in which I have so imprudently involved you. But nothing can be more clear, nothing more plain than your position henceforth. The King Louis XIV. Has no longer now but one enemy. That enemy is myself, myself alone. I have made you a prisoner. You have followed me. Today I liberate you. You fly back to your prince. You can perceive, Porthos, there is not one difficulty in all this."
"Do you think so?"
said Porthos. "I am quite sure of it."
"Then why,"
said the admirable good sense of Porthos,
"then why, if we are in such an easy position, why, my friend, do we prepare cannon, muskets, and engines of all sorts? It seems to me it would be much more simple to say to Captain d'Artagnan, 'My dear friend, we have been mistaken; that error is to be repaired. Open the door to us, let us pass through, and we will say good bye.'"
"Ah, that!" said Aramis, shaking his head.
"Why do you say that? Do you not approve of my plan, my friend?"
"I see a difficulty in it."
"What is it?"
"The hypothesis that D'Artagnan may come with orders which will oblige us to defend ourselves."
"What! Defend ourselves against D'Artagnan? Ah, folly! Against the good D'Artagnan!"
Aramis once more replied by shaking his head. "Porthos," at length said he, "if I have had the matches lighted and the guns pointed, if I have had the signal of alarm sounded, if I have called every man to his post upon the ramparts, those good ramparts of Belle Isle which you have so well fortified, it was not for nothing. Wait to judge, or rather, no, do not wait."
"What can I do?"
"If I knew, my friend, I would have told you."
"But there is one thing much more simple than defending ourselves: a boat, and away for France, where—"
"My dear friend," said Aramis, smiling with a strong shade of sadness, "do not let us reason like children; let us be men in council and in execution. But hark! I hear a hail for landing at the port. Attention, Porthos, serious attention."
"It is D'Artagnan, no doubt,"
said Porthos in a voice of thunder, approaching the parapet. "Yes, it is I," replied the captain of the musketeers, running lightly up the steps of the mole, and gaining rapidly the little esplanade on which his two friends waited for him. As soon as he came towards them, Porthos and Aramis observed an officer who followed D'Artagnan, treading apparently in his very steps. The captain stopped upon the stairs of the mole when halfway up. His companions imitated him. "Make your men draw back," cried D'Artagnan to Porthos and Aramis. "Let them retire out of hearing." This order, given by Porthos, was executed immediately. Then D'Artagnan, turning towards him, who followed him: "Monsieur," said he, "we are no longer on board the king's fleet, where, in virtue of your order, you spoke so arrogantly to me just now."
"Monsieur," replied the officer, "I did not speak arrogantly to you. I simply but rigorously obeyed instructions. I was commanded to follow you. I follow you. I am directed not to allow you to communicate with any one without taking cognizance of what you do. I am in duty bound, accordingly, to overhear your conversations."
D'Artagnan trembled with rage, and Porthos and Aramis, who heard this dialogue, trembled likewise, but with uneasiness and fear. D'Artagnan, biting his mustache with that vivacity which denoted in him exasperation, closely to be followed by an explosion, approached the officer. "Monsieur," said he, in a low voice, so much the more impressive, that, affecting calm, it threatened tempest. Monsieur, when I sent a canoe hither, you wished to know what I wrote to the defenders of Belle Isle. You produced an order to that effect, and in my turn I instantly showed you the note I had written. When the skipper of the boat sent by me returned, when I received the reply of these two gentlemen, and he pointed to Aramis and Porthos, you heard every word of what the messenger said. All that was plainly in your orders, all that was well executed, very punctually, was it not?"
"Yes, monsieur,"
stammered the officer.
"Yes, without doubt, but
Monsieur," continued D'Artagnan, growing warm, "Monsieur, when I manifested the intention of quitting my vessel to cross to Belle Isle, you demanded to accompany me. I did not hesitate, I brought you with me. You are now at Belle Isle, are you not?"
"Yes, monsieur, but
the question no longer is of Monsieur Colbert, who has given you that order, or of whomsoever in the world you are following the instructions. The question now is of a man who is a clog upon Monsieur d'Artagnan, and who is alone with Monsieur d'Artagnan upon steps whose feet are bathed by 30 feet of salt water. A bad position for that man, a bad position, monsieur, I warn you." "But, monsieur, if I am a restraint upon you," said the officer, timidly and almost faintly, "it is my duty which—" "Monsieur, you have had the misfortune, either you or those that sent you, to insult me. It is done. I cannot seek redress from those who employ you. They are unknown to me, or are at too great a distance. But you are under my hand, and I swear that if you make one step behind me when I raise my feet to go up to those gentlemen, I swear to you by my name, I will cleave your head in two with my sword and pitch you into the water. Oh, it will happen, it will happen. I have only been 6 times angry in my life, monsieur, and all 5 preceding times I killed my man." The officer did not stir. He became pale under this terrible threat, but replied with simplicity, "Monsieur, you are wrong in acting against my orders." Porthos and Aramis, mute and trembling at the top of the parapet, cried to the musketeer, "Good D'Artagnan, take care!" D'Artagnan made them a sign to keep silence, raised his foot with ominous calmness to mount the stair, and turned round, sword in hand, to see if the officer followed him. The officer made a sign of the cross, and stepped up. Porthos and Aramis, who knew their D'Artagnan, uttered a cry, and rushed down to prevent the blow they thought they already heard. But D'Artagnan passed his sword into his left hand. "Monsieur," said he to the officer, in an agitated voice, "you are a brave man. You will all the better comprehend what I am going to say to you now." "Speak, Monsieur d'Artagnan, speak," replied the officer. "These gentlemen we have just seen, and against whom you have orders, are my friends." "I know they are, monsieur." "You can understand whether or not I ought to act towards them as your instructions prescribe." "I understand your reserve." "Very well. Permit me, then, to converse with them without a witness." "Monsieur d'Artagnan, if I yield to your request, if I do that which you beg me, I break my word; but if I do not do it, I disoblige you. I prefer the one dilemma to the other. Converse with your friends, and do not despise me, monsieur, for doing this for your sake, whom I esteem and honor. Do not despise me for committing for you, and you alone, an unworthy act." D'Artagnan, much agitated, threw his arm round the neck of the young man, and then went up to his friends. The officer, enveloped in his cloak, sat down on the damp, weed covered steps. "Well," said D'Artagnan to his friends, "such is my position, judge for yourselves." All three embraced as in the glorious days of their youth.
"What is the meaning of all these preparations?"
said Porthos. "You ought to have a suspicion of what they signify," said D'Artagnan.
"Not any, I assure you, my dear captain; for, in fact, I have done nothing. No more has Aramis,"
the worthy baron hastened to say. D'Artagnan darted a reproachful look at the prelate, which penetrated that hardened heart.
"Dear Porthos!"
cried the bishop of Vannes. "You see what is being done against you," said D'Artagnan. "Interception of all boats coming to or going from Belle Isle. Your means of transport seized. If you had endeavored to fly, you would have fallen into the hands of the cruisers that plow the sea in all directions, on the watch for you. The king wants you to be taken, and he will take you." D'Artagnan tore at his gray mustache. Aramis grew somber, Porthos angry. "My idea was this," continued D'Artagnan, "to make you both come on board, to keep you near me, and restore you your liberty. But now, who can say, when I return to my ship, I may not find a superior, that I may not find secret orders which will take from me my command, and give it to another, who will dispose of me and you without hope of help?"
"We must remain at Belle Isle,"
said Aramis, resolutely.
"and I assure you, for my part, I will not surrender easily."
Porthos said nothing. D'Artagnan remarked the silence of his friend. "I have another trial to make of this officer, of this brave fellow who accompanies me, and whose courageous resistance makes me very happy, for it denotes an honest man, who, though an enemy, is 1,000 times better than a complacent coward. Let us try to learn from him what his instructions are, and what his orders permit or forbid."
"Let us try,"
said Aramis. D'Artagnan went to the parapet, leaned over towards the steps of the mole, and called the officer, who immediately came up. "Monsieur," said D'Artagnan, after having exchanged the cordial courtesies natural between gentlemen who know and appreciate each other, "Monsieur, if I wished to take away these gentlemen from here, what would you do?"
"I should not oppose it, monsieur,
but having direct explicit orders to put them under guard, I should detain them." "Ah!" said D'Artagnan.
"That's all over,"
said Aramis, gloomily. Porthos did not stir.
"But still take Porthos," said the bishop of Vannes. "He can prove to the king, and I will help him do so, and you too, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that he had nothing to do with this affair."
Said D'Artagnan. "Will you come? Will you follow me, Porthos? The king is merciful."
"I want time for reflection,"
said Porthos. "You will remain here, then?"
"Until fresh orders,"
said Aramis, with vivacity. "Until we have an idea," resumed D'Artagnan, "and I now believe that will not be long, for I have one already."
"Let us say adieu, then," said Aramis. "But in truth, my good Porthos, you ought to go."
"No," said the latter, laconically.
"As you please,"
replied Aramis, a little wounded in his susceptibilities at the morose tone of his companion.
"Only I am reassured by the promise of an idea from D'Artagnan, an idea I fancy I have divined."
"Let us see," said the musketeer, placing his ear near Aramis's mouth. The latter spoke several words rapidly, to which D'Artagnan replied, "That is it, precisely."
"Infallible!"
cried Aramis. "During the first emotion this resolution will cause, take care of yourself, Aramis."
"Oh, don't be afraid."
"Now, monsieur," said D'Artagnan to the officer, "thanks, 1,000 thanks. You have made yourself 3 friends for life."
"Yes,"
added Aramis. Porthos alone said nothing, but merely bowed. D'Artagnan, having tenderly embraced his 2 old friends, left Belle Isle with the inseparable companion with whom M. Colbert had saddled him. Thus, with the exception of the explanation with which the worthy Porthos had been willing to be satisfied, nothing had changed in appearance in the fate of one or the other. "Only," said Aramis, "there is D'Artagnan's idea." D'Artagnan did not return on board without profoundly analyzing the idea he had discovered. Now, we know that whatever D'Artagnan did examine, according to custom, daylight was certain to illuminate. As to the officer, now grown mute again, he had full time for meditation. Therefore, on putting his foot on board his vessel, moored within cannon shot of the island, the captain of the musketeers had already got together all his means, offensive and defensive. He immediately assembled his council, which consisted of the officers serving under his orders. These were 8 in number, a chief of the maritime forces, a major directing the artillery, an engineer, the officer we are acquainted with, and 4 lieutenants. Having assembled them, D'Artagnan arose, took off his hat, and addressed them thus: "Gentlemen, I have been to reconnoiter Belle Ile en Mer, and I have found in it a good and solid garrison. Moreover, preparations are made for a defense that may prove troublesome. I therefore intend to send for 2 of the principal officers of the place, that we may converse with them. Having separated them from their troops and cannon, we shall be better able to deal with them, particularly by reasoning with them. Is not this your opinion, gentlemen?" The major of artillery rose. "Monsieur," said he, with respect but firmness, "I have heard you say that the place is preparing to make a troublesome defense. The place is then, as you know, determined on rebellion?" D'Artagnan was visibly put out by this reply, but he was not the man to allow himself to be subdued by a trifle, and resumed: "Monsieur," said he, "your reply is just, but you are ignorant that Belle Ile is a fief of Monsieur Fouquet's, and that former monarchs gave the right to the seigneurs of Belle Ile to arm their people." The major made a movement. "Oh, do not interrupt me," continued D'Artagnan. "You are going to tell me that that right to arm themselves against the English was not a right to arm themselves against their king. But it is not Monsieur Fouquet, I suppose, who holds Belle Ile at this moment, since I arrested Monsieur Fouquet the day before yesterday. Now the inhabitants and defenders of Belle Ile know nothing of this arrest. You would announce it to them in vain. It is a thing so unheard of and extraordinary, so unexpected, that they would not believe you. A Breton serves his master, and not his masters. He serves his master till he has seen him dead. Now the Bretons, as far as I know, have not seen the body of Monsieur Fouquet. It is not then surprising they hold out against that which is neither Monsieur Fouquet nor his signature." The major bowed in token of assent. "That is why," continued D'Artagnan, "I propose to cause 2 of the principal officers of the garrison to come on board my vessel. They will see you, gentlemen; they will see the forces we have at our disposal; they will consequently know to what they have to trust, and the fate that attends them, in case of rebellion. We will affirm to them, upon our honor, that Monsieur Fouquet is a prisoner, and that all resistance can only be prejudicial to them. We will tell them that at the first cannon fired, there will be no further hope of mercy from the king. Then, or so at least I trust, they will resist no longer. They will yield up without fighting, and we shall have a place given up to us in a friendly way, which it might cost prodigious efforts to subdue." The officer who had followed D'Artagnan to Belle Ile was preparing to speak, but D'Artagnan interrupted him. "Yes, I know what you are going to tell me, monsieur. I know that there is an order of the king's to prevent all secret communications with the defenders of Belle Ile, and that is exactly why I do not offer to communicate except in presence of my staff." And D'Artagnan made an inclination of the head to his officers, who knew him well enough to attach a certain value to the condescension. The officers looked at each other as if to read each other's opinions in their eyes, with the intention of evidently acting, should they agree, according to the desire of D'Artagnan. And already the latter saw with joy that the result of their consent would be sending a bark to Porthos and Aramis, when the king's officer drew from a pocket a folded paper, which he placed in the hands of D'Artagnan. This paper bore upon its superscription the number 1. "What more?" murmured the surprised captain. "Read, monsieur," said the officer, with a courtesy that was not free from sadness. D'Artagnan, full of mistrust, unfolded the paper and read these words: "Prohibition to Monsieur d'Artagnan to assemble any council whatever, or to deliberate in any way before Belle Isle be surrendered and the prisoners shot. Signed, Louis." D'Artagnan repressed the quiver of impatience that ran through his whole body, and with a gracious smile, "That is well, monsieur," said he. "The king's orders shall be complied with." End of chapter. Chapter 44 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 44. Result of the ideas of the king and the ideas of D'Artagnan. The blow was direct. It was severe, mortal. D'Artagnan, furious at having been anticipated by an idea of the king's, did not despair, however, even yet, and reflecting upon the idea he had brought back from Belle Isle, he elicited therefrom novel means of safety for his friends. "Gentlemen," said he, suddenly, "since the king has charged some other than myself with his secret orders, it must be because I no longer possess his confidence, and I should really be unworthy of it if I had the courage to hold a command subject to so many injurious suspicions. Therefore I will go immediately and carry my resignation to the king. I tender it before you all, enjoining you all to fall back with me upon the coast of France, in such a way as not to compromise the safety of the forces his majesty has confided to me. For this purpose, return all to your posts. Within an hour we shall have the ebb of the tide. To your posts, gentlemen. I suppose," added he, on seeing that all prepared to obey him, except the surveillant officer, "you have no orders to object this time?" And D'Artagnan almost triumphed while speaking these words. This plan would prove the safety of his friends. The blockade once raised, they might embark immediately, and set sail for England or Spain, without fear of being molested. Whilst they were making their escape, D'Artagnan would return to the king, would justify his return by the indignation which the mistrust of Colbert had raised in him. He would be sent back with full powers, and he would take Belle Isle, that is to say, the cage, after the birds had flown. But to this plan the officer opposed a further order of the king's. It was thus conceived: "From the moment Monsieur d'Artagnan shall have manifested the desire of giving in his resignation, he shall no longer be reckoned leader of the expedition, and every officer placed under his orders shall be held to no longer obey him. Moreover, the said Monsieur d'Artagnan, having lost that quality of leader of the army sent against Belle Isle, shall set out immediately for France, accompanied by the officer who will have remitted the message to him, and who will consider him a prisoner for whom he is answerable." Brave and careless as he was, D'Artagnan turned pale. Everything had been calculated with a depth of precognition which, for the first time in 30 years, recalled to him the solid foresight and inflexible logic of the great cardinal. He leaned his head on his hand, thoughtful, scarcely breathing. "If I were to put this order in my pocket," thought he, "who would know it? What would prevent my doing it? Before the king had had time to be informed, I should have saved those poor fellows yonder. Let us exercise some small audacity. My head is not one of those the executioner strikes off for disobedience. We will disobey." But at the moment he was about to adopt this plan, he saw the officers around him reading similar orders, which the passive agent of the thoughts of that infernal Colbert had distributed to them. This contingency of his disobedience had been foreseen, as all the rest had been. "Monsieur," said the officer, coming up to him, "I await your good pleasure to depart." "I am ready, monsieur," replied D'Artagnan, grinding his teeth. The officer immediately ordered a canoe to receive M. d'Artagnan and himself. At sight of this, he became almost distraught with rage. "How," stammered he, "will you carry on the directions of the different corps?" "When you are gone, monsieur," replied the commander of the fleet, "it is to me the command of the whole is committed." "Then, monsieur," rejoined Colbert's man, addressing the new leader, "it is for you that this last order remitted to me is intended. Let us see your powers." "Here they are," said the officer, exhibiting the royal signature. "Here are your instructions," replied the officer, placing the folded paper in his hands, and turning round towards D'Artagnan. "Come, monsieur," said he, in an agitated voice, such despair did he behold in that man of iron, "do me the favor to depart at once." "Immediately," articulated D'Artagnan, feebly, subdued, crushed by implacable impossibility. And he painfully subsided into the little boat, which started, favored by wind and tide, for the coast of France. The king's guards embarked with him. The musketeer still preserved the hope of reaching Nantes quickly, and of pleading the cause of his friends eloquently enough to incline the king to mercy. The bark flew like a swallow. D'Artagnan distinctly saw the land of France profiled in black against the white clouds of night. "Ah, monsieur," said he in a low voice to the officer to whom, for an hour, he had ceased speaking, "what would I give to know the instructions for the new commander? They are all pacific, are they not? And He did not finish. The thunder of a distant cannon rolled athwart the waves, another, and two or three still louder. D'Artagnan shuddered. "They have commenced the siege of Belle Isle," replied the officer. The canoe had just touched the soil of France. End of chapter. Chapter 45 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 45. The Ancestors of Porthos. When D'Artagnan left Aramis and Porthos, the latter returned to the principal fort in order to converse with greater liberty. Porthos, still thoughtful, was a restraint on Aramis, whose mind had never felt itself more free. "Dear Porthos," said he suddenly, "I will explain D'Artagnan's idea to you." "What idea, Aramis?" "An idea to which we shall owe our liberty within 12 hours." "Ah, indeed!" said Porthos, much astonished. "Let us hear it." "Did you remark, in the scene our friend had with the officer, that certain orders constrained him with regard to us?" "Yes, I did notice that." "Well, D'Artagnan is going to give in his resignation to the king, and during the confusion that will result from his absence, we will get away, or rather, you will get away, Porthos, if there is possibility of flight for only one." Here Porthos shook his head and replied, "We will escape together, Aramis, or we will stay together." "Thine is a generous heart," said Aramis. "Only your melancholy uneasiness affects me." "I am not uneasy," said Porthos. "Then you are angry with me?" "I am not angry with you." "Then why, my friend, do you put on such a dismal countenance?" "I will tell you. I am making my will." and while saying these words, the good Porthos looked sadly in the face of Aramis.
"Your will!"
cried the bishop.
"What, then? Do you think yourself lost?"
"I feel fatigued. It is the first time, and there is a custom in our family."
"What is it, my friend?"
"My grandfather was a man twice as strong as I am."
"Indeed!" said Aramis. "Then your grandfather must have been Samson himself."
"No, his name was Antoine. Well, he was about my age, when setting out one day for the chase, he felt his legs weak, the man who had never known what weakness was before."
"What was the meaning of that fatigue, my friend?"
"Nothing good, as you will see; for having set out, complaining still of weakness of the legs, he met a wild boar, which made head against him. He missed him with his arquebuse, and was ripped up by the beast and died immediately."
"There is no reason in that why you should alarm yourself, dear Porthos."
"Oh, you will see. My father was as strong again as I am. He was a rough soldier, under Henry III. and Henry IV. His name was not Antoine, but Gaspard, the same as M. de Coligny. Always on horseback, he had never known what lassitude was. One evening, as he rose from table, his legs failed him."
"He had supped heartily, perhaps," said Aramis, "and that was why he staggered."
"Bah! A friend of M. de Bassompierre? Nonsense! No, no. He was astonished at this lassitude, and said to my mother, who laughed at him, 'Would not one believe I was going to meet with a wild boar, as the late M. de Vallon, my father, did?'"
"Well?" said Aramis.
"Well, having this weakness, my father insisted upon going down into the garden, instead of going to bed. His foot slipped on the first stair. The staircase was steep. My father fell against a stone in which an iron hinge was fixed. The hinge gashed his temple, and he was stretched out dead upon the spot."
Aramis raised his eyes to his friend. "These are two extraordinary circumstances," said he. "Let us not infer that there may succeed a third. It is not becoming in a man of your strength to be superstitious, my brave Porthos. Besides, when were your legs known to fail? Never have you stood so firm, so haughtily. Why, you could carry a house on your shoulders."
"At this moment," said Porthos, "I feel myself pretty active, but at times I vacillate, I sink, and lately this phenomenon, as you say, has occurred 4 times. I will not say this frightens me, but it annoys me. Life is an agreeable thing. I have money, I have fine estates, I have horses that I love, I have also friends that I love. D'Artagnan, Athos, Raoul, and you."
The admirable Porthos did not even take the trouble to dissimulate in the very presence of Aramis the rank he gave him in his friendship. Aramis pressed his hand. "We will still live many years," said he, "to preserve to the world such specimens of its rarest men. Trust yourself to me, my friend. We have no reply from D'Artagnan; that is a good sign. He must have given orders to get the vessels together and clear the sea. On my part, I have just issued directions that a bark should be rolled on rollers to the mouth of the great cavern of Locmaria, which you know, where we have so often lain in wait for the foxes."
"Yes, and which terminates at the little creek by a trench, where we discovered the day that splendid fox escaped that way." "Precisely. In case of misfortunes, a bark is to be concealed for us in that cavern. Indeed, it must be there by this time. We will wait for a favorable moment, and during the night we will go to sea." "That is a grand idea. What shall we gain by it?"
"We shall gain this. Nobody knows that grotto, or rather its issue, except ourselves and 2 or 3 hunters of the island. We shall gain this, that if the island is occupied, the scouts, seeing no bark upon the shore, will never imagine we can escape, and will cease to watch."
"I understand."
"Well, that weakness in the legs?" Oh, better, much, just now.
You see, then, plainly, that everything conspires to give us quietude and hope. D'Artagnan will sweep the sea and leave us free. No royal fleet or descent to be dreaded. Vive Dieu! Porthos, we have still half a century of magnificent adventure before us. And if I once touch Spanish ground, I swear to you," added the bishop with terrible energy, "that your brevet of duke is not such a chance as it is said to be."
"We live by hope,"
said Porthos, enlivened by the warmth of his companion. All at once a cry resounded in their ears: "To arms! To arms!" This cry, repeated by 100 throats, piercing the chamber where the two friends were conversing, carried surprise to one, and uneasiness to the other. Aramis opened the window. He saw a crowd of people running with flambeaux. Women were seeking places of safety; the armed population were hastening to their posts. "The fleet! The fleet!" cried a soldier, who recognized Aramis.
"The fleet?"
repeated the latter.
"Within half cannon shot," continued the soldier.
"To arms!" cried Aramis.
"To arms!"
repeated Porthos formidably, and both rushed forth towards the mole to place themselves within the shelter of the batteries. Boats, laden with soldiers, were seen approaching, and in 3 directions, for the purpose of landing at 3 points at once. "What must be done?" said an officer of the guard.
"Stop them, and if they persist, fire,"
said Aramis. 5 minutes later the cannonade commenced. These were the shots that D'Artagnan had heard as he landed in France. But the boats were too near the mole to allow the cannon to aim correctly. They landed, and the combat commenced, hand to hand.
"What's the matter, Porthos?"
said Aramis to his friend.
"Nothing, nothing, only my legs. It is really incomprehensible. They will be better when we charge."
In fact, Porthos and Aramis did charge with such vigor, and so thoroughly animated their men, that the royalists re embarked precipitately, without gaining anything but the wounds they carried away.
"Hey, but Porthos!" cried Aramis, "we must have a prisoner, quick, quick!"
Porthos bent over the stair of the mole, and seized by the nape of the neck one of the officers of the royal army who was waiting to embark till all his people should be in the boat. The arm of the giant lifted up his prey, which served him as a buckler, and he recovered himself without a shot being fired at him.
"Here is a prisoner for you," said Porthos coolly to Aramis.
"Well," cried the latter, laughing,
"did you not calumniate your legs?"
"It was not with my legs I captured him," said Porthos;
"it was with my arms."
End of chapter. Chapter 46 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 46. The Son of Biscaia. The Bretons of the Isle were very proud of this victory. Aramis did not encourage them in the feeling.
"What will happen,"
said he to Porthos when everybody was gone home,
"will be that the anger of the king will be roused by the account of the resistance,
and that these brave people will be decimated or shot when they are taken, which cannot fail to take place."
"From which it results, then," said Porthos, "that what we have done is of not the slightest use."
"For the moment, it may be," replied the bishop, "for we have a prisoner from whom we shall learn what our enemies are preparing to do."
"Yes, let us interrogate the prisoner,"
said Porthos,
"and the means of making him speak are very simple. We are going to supper. We will invite him to join us. As he drinks, he will talk."
This was done. The officer was at first rather uneasy, but became reassured on seeing what sort of men he had to deal with. He gave, without having any fear of compromising himself, all the details imaginable of the resignation and departure of D'Artagnan. He explained how, after that departure, The new leader of the expedition had ordered a surprise upon Belle Isle. There his explanations stopped. Aramis and Porthos exchanged a glance that evinced their despair. No more dependence to be placed now on D'Artagnan's fertile imagination. No further resource in the event of defeat. Aramis, continuing his interrogations, asked the prisoner what the leaders of the expedition contemplated doing with the leaders of Belle Isle. "The orders are," replied he, "to kill during combat, or hang afterwards." Porthos and Aramis looked at each other again, and the color mounted to their faces. "I am too light for the gallows," replied Aramis. "People like me are not hung." "And I am too heavy," said Porthos. "People like me break the cord." "I am sure," said the prisoner, gallantly, "that we could have guaranteed you the exact kind of death you preferred." "1,000 thanks," said Aramis, seriously. Porthos bowed. "One more cup of wine to your health," said he, drinking himself. From one subject to another the chat with the officer was prolonged. He was an intelligent gentleman, and suffered himself to be led on by the charm of Aramis's wit and Porthos's cordial bonhomie. "Pardon me," said he, "if I address a question to you, but men who are in their sixth bottle have a clear right to forget themselves a little." "Address it!" cried Porthos. "Address it!" "Speak," said Aramis. "Were you not, gentlemen, both in the musketeers of the late king?" "Yes, monsieur, and amongst the best of them, if you please," said Porthos. "That is true. I should say even the best of all soldiers, messieurs, if I did not fear to offend the memory of my father." "Of your father?" cried Aramis. "Do you know what my name is?" "Ma foi! No, monsieur, but you can tell us, and—" "I am called Georges de Biscarat." "Oh!" cried Porthos, in his turn. "Biscarat! Do you remember that name, Aramis?" "Biscarat," reflected the bishop. "It seems to me—" "Try to recollect, monsieur," said the officer. "Pardieu, that won't take me long," said Porthos. "Biscarat, called Cardinal, one of the four who interrupted us on the day on which we formed our friendship with D'Artagnan, sword in hand." "Precisely, gentlemen." "The only one," cried Aramis, eagerly, "we could not scratch." "Consequently, a capital blade?" said the prisoner. "That's true, most true!" exclaimed both friends together. "Ma foi! Monsieur Biscarat, we are delighted to make the acquaintance of such a brave man's son." Biscarat pressed the hands held out by the two musketeers. Aramis looked at Porthos as much as to say, "Here is a man who will help us." And without delay, "Confess, monsieur," said he, "that it is good to have once been a good man." "My father always said so, monsieur." "Confess likewise that it is a sad circumstance in which you find yourself, of falling in with men destined to be shot or hung, and to learn that these men are old acquaintances, in fact, hereditary friends." "Oh, you are not reserved for such a frightful fate as that, messieurs and friends," said the young man, warmly. "Bah! you said so yourself." "I said so just now, when I did not know you; but now that I know you, I say, you will evade this dismal fate if you wish." "How, if we wish?" echoed Aramis, whose eyes beamed with intelligence as he looked alternately at the prisoner and Porthos. "Provided," continued Porthos, looking in his turn with noble intrepidity at Monsieur Biscarat and the bishop, "provided nothing disgraceful be required of us." "Nothing at all will be required of you, gentlemen," replied the officer. "What should they ask of you? If they find you, they will kill you; that is a predetermined thing. Try, then, gentlemen, to prevent their finding you." "I don't think I am mistaken," said Porthos, with dignity, "but it appears evident to me
that if they want to find us, they must come and seek us here." "In that you are perfectly right, my worthy friend," replied Aramis, constantly consulting with his looks the countenance of Biscarrat, who had grown silent and constrained. "You wish, Monsieur de Biscarrat, to say something to us, to make us some overture, and you dare not. Is that true?" "Ah, gentlemen and friends, it is because by speaking I betray the watchword. But hark! I hear a voice that frees mine by dominating it." "Cannon!" said Porthos. "Cannon and musketry, too!" cried the bishop. On hearing at a distance, among the rocks, these sinister reports of a combat which they thought had ceased. "What can that be?" asked Porthos. "Eh, pardieu!" cried Aramis, "that is just what I expected." "What is that?" "That the attack made by you was nothing but a feint. Is that not true, monsieur? And whilst your companions allowed themselves to be repulsed, you were certain of effecting a landing on the other side of the island." "Oh, several, monsieur." "We are lost, then," said the bishop of Vannes, quietly. "Lost! That is possible," replied the Seigneur de Pierrefonds, "but we are not taken or hung." And so saying, he rose from the table, went to the wall, and coolly took down his sword and pistols, which he examined with the care of an old soldier who is preparing for battle, and who feels that life, in a great measure, depends upon the excellence and right conditions of his arms. At the report of the cannon, at the news of the surprise which might deliver up the island to the royal troops, the terrified crowd rushed precipitately to the fort to demand assistance and advice from their leaders. Aramis, pale and downcast, between two flambeaux, showed himself at the window which looked into the principal court, full of soldiers waiting for orders, and bewildered inhabitants imploring succor. "My friends," said D'Herblay, in a grave and sonorous voice, "Monsieur Fouquet, your protector, your friend, your father, has been arrested by an order of the king and thrown into the Bastille." A sustained yell of vengeful fury came floating up to the window at which the bishop stood, and enveloped him in a magnetic field. "Avenge Monsieur Fouquet!" cried the most excited of his hearers. "Death to the royalists!" "No, my friends," replied Aramis, solemnly. "No, my friends, no resistance. The king is master in his kingdom. The king is the mandatory of God. The king and God have struck Monsieur Fouquet. Humble yourselves before the hand of God. Love God and the king, who have struck Monsieur Fouquet. But do not avenge your seigneur. Do not think of avenging him. You would sacrifice yourselves in vain, you, your wives and children, your property, your liberty. Lay down your arms, my friends, lay down your arms, since the king commands you so to do, and retire peaceably to your dwellings. It is I who ask you to do so. It is I who beg you to do so. It is I who now, in the hour of need, command you to do so, in the name of Monsieur Fouquet." The crowd collected under the window uttered a prolonged roar of anger and terror. "The soldiers of Louis XIV. Have reached the island," continued Aramis. "From this time it would no longer be a fight betwixt them and you, it would be a massacre. Begone, then, begone and forget. This time I command you, in the name of the Lord of hosts." The mutineers retired slowly, submissive, silent. "Ah! what have you just been saying, my friend?" said Porthos. "Monsieur," said Biscarrat to the bishop, "you may save all these inhabitants, but thus you will neither save yourself nor your friend." "Monsieur de Biscarrat," said the bishop of Vannes, with a singular accent of nobility and courtesy, "Monsieur de Biscarrat, be kind enough to resume your liberty." "I am very willing to do so, monsieur, but " "That would render us a service, for when announcing to the king's lieutenant the submission of the islanders,
You will perhaps obtain some grace for us on informing him of the manner in which that submission has been effected."
"Grace!" replied Porthos with flashing eyes. "What is the meaning of that word?"
Aramis touched the elbow of his friend roughly, as he had been accustomed to do in the days of their youth, when he wanted to warn Porthos that he had committed, or was about to commit, a blunder. Porthos understood him, and was silent immediately. "I will go, messieurs," replied Biscarrat, a little surprised likewise at the word grace pronounced by the haughty musketeer, of and to whom, but a few minutes before, he had related with so much enthusiasm the heroic exploits with which his father had delighted him. "Go, then, Monsieur Biscarrat," said Aramis, bowing to him, "and at parting receive the expression of our entire gratitude." "But you, monsieur, you whom I think it is an honor to call my friends, since you have been willing to accept that title, what will become of you in the meantime?" replied the officer, very much agitated at taking leave of the two ancient adversaries of his father. "We will wait here."
"But, mon Dieu, the order is precise and formal."
"I am Bishop of Vannes, Monsieur de Biscarrat, and they no more shoot a bishop than they hang a gentleman."
"Ah, yes, monsieur, yes, monseigneur," replied Biscarrat. "It is true, you are right. There is still that chance for you. Then I will depart. I will repair to the commander of the expedition, the king's lieutenant. Adieu, then, messieurs, or rather, to meet again, I hope." The worthy officer, jumping upon a horse given him by Aramis, departed in the direction of the sound of cannon, which, by surging the crowd into the fort, had interrupted the conversation of the two friends with their prisoner. Aramis watched the departure, and when left alone with Porthos, "Well, do you comprehend?" said he. "Ma foi, no."
"Did not Biscarrat inconvenience you here?"
"No, he is a brave fellow."
"Yes, but the grotto of Locmaria, is it necessary all the world should know it?"
"Ah, that is true, that is true, I comprehend. We are going to escape by the cavern."
"If you please," cried Aramis, gayly.
"Forward, friend Porthos, our boat awaits us. King Louis has not caught us yet."
End of chapter. Chapter 47 of The Man in the Iron Mask. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 47. The Grotto of Locmaria. The cavern of Locmaria was sufficiently distant from the mole to render it necessary for our friends to husband their strength in order to reach it. Besides, night was advancing. Midnight had struck at the fort. Porthos and Aramis were loaded with money and arms. They walked, then, across the heath, which stretched between the mole and the cavern, listening to every noise, in order better to avoid an ambush. From time to time, on the road which they had carefully left on their left, passed fugitives coming from the interior, at the news of the landing of the royal troops. Aramis and Porthos, concealed behind some projecting mass of rock, collected the words that escaped from the poor people, who fled trembling, carrying with them their most valuable effects, and tried, whilst listening to their complaints, to gather something from them for their own interest. At length, after a rapid race, frequently interrupted by prudent stoppages, they reached the deep grottos, in which the prophetic Bishop of Vannes had taken care to have secreted a bark capable of keeping the sea at this fine season.
"My good friend," said Porthos, panting vigorously, "we have arrived, it seems. But I thought you spoke of 3 men, 3 servants, who were to accompany us. I don't see them. Where are they?"
"Why should you see them, Porthos?" replied Aramis. "They are certainly waiting for us in the cavern, and no doubt are resting, having accomplished their rough and difficult task." Aramis stopped Porthos, who was preparing to enter the cavern. "Will you allow me, my friend," said he to the giant, "to pass in first? I know the signal I have given to these men, who, not hearing it, would be very likely to fire upon you or slash away with their knives in the dark." "Go on, then, Aramis, go on. Go first. You impersonate wisdom and foresight. Go. Ah! There is that fatigue again, of which I spoke to you. It has just seized me afresh." Aramis left Porthos sitting at the entrance of the grotto, and bowing his head, he penetrated into the interior of the cavern, imitating the cry of the owl. A little plaintive cooing, a scarcely distinct echo, replied from the depths of the cave. Aramis pursued his way cautiously, and soon was stopped by the same kind of cry as he had first uttered, within 10 paces of him. "Are you there, Yves?" said the bishop.
"Yes, monseigneur. Goen is here likewise. His son accompanies us."
"That is well. Are all things ready?"
"Yes, monseigneur."
"Go to the entrance of the grottos, my good Yves, and you will there find the Seigneur de Pierrefonds, who is resting after the fatigue of our journey; and if he should happen not to be able to walk, lift him up and bring him hither to me." The 3 men obeyed, but the recommendation given to his servants was superfluous. Porthos, refreshed, had already commenced the descent, and his heavy step resounded amongst the cavities, formed and supported by columns of porphyry and granite. As soon as the Seigneur de Bracieux had rejoined the bishop, the Bretons lighted a lantern with which they were furnished, and Porthos assured his friend that he felt as strong again as ever. "Let us inspect the boat," said Aramis, "and satisfy ourselves at once what it will hold."
"Do not go too near with the light," said the patron Yves, "for as you desired me, monseigneur, I have placed under the bench of the poop, in the coffer you know of, the barrel of powder, and the musket charges that you sent me from the fort."
"Very well," said Aramis, and taking the lantern himself, he examined minutely all parts of the canoe, with the precautions of a man who is neither timid nor ignorant in the face of danger. The canoe was long, light, drawing little water, thin of keel; in short, one of those that have always been so aptly built at Belle Isle, a little high in its sides, solid upon the water, very manageable, furnished with planks which, in uncertain weather, formed a sort of deck over which the waves might glide, so as to protect the rowers. In 2 well-closed coffers, placed beneath the benches of the prow and the poop, Aramis found bread, biscuit, dried fruits, a quarter of bacon, a good provision of water in leathern bottles, the whole forming rations sufficient for people who did not mean to quit the coast, and would be able to revictual if necessity commanded. The arms, 8 muskets, and as many horse pistols, were in good condition, and all loaded. There were additional oars, in case of accident, and that little sail called trinquet, which assists the speed of the canoe at the same time the boatmen row, and is so useful when the breeze is slack. When Aramis had seen to all these things, and appeared satisfied with the results of his inspection, "Let us consult Porthos," said he, "to know if we must endeavor to get the boat out by the unknown extremity of the grotto, following the descent and the shade of the cavern, or whether it be better, in the open air, to make it slide upon its rollers through the bushes, leveling the road of the little beach, which is but 20 feet high, and gives at high tide 3 or 4 fathoms of good water upon a sound bottom."
"It must be as you please, monseigneur," replied the skipper Yves, respectfully; "but I don't believe that by the slope of the cavern, and in the dark in which we shall be obliged to maneuver our boat, the road will be so convenient as the open air. I know the beach well, and can certify that it is as smooth as a grass plot in a garden. The interior of the grotto, on the contrary, is rough, without reckoning, monseigneur, that at its extremity we shall come to the trench which leads into the sea, and perhaps the canoe will not pass down it."
"I have made my calculation," said the bishop, "and I am certain it will pass."
"So be it. I wish it may, monseigneur," continued Yves. "But your highness knows very well that to make it reach the extremity of the trench, there is an enormous stone to be lifted, that under which the fox always passes, and which closes the trench like a door."
"It can be raised," said Porthos. "That is nothing."
"Oh, I know that monseigneur has the strength of 10 men," replied Yves, "but that is giving him a great deal of trouble."
"I think the skipper may be right," said Aramis. "Let us try the open air passage."
"The more so, monseigneur," continued the fisherman, "that we should not be able to embark before day. It will require so much labor, and that as soon as daylight appears, a good vedette placed outside the grotto would be necessary, indispensable even, to watch the maneuvers of the lighters or cruisers that are on the lookout for us."
"Yes, yes, Yves, your reasons are good. We will go by the beach." And the three robust Bretons went to the boat, and were beginning to place their rollers underneath it to put it in motion, when the distant barking of dogs was heard, proceeding from the interior of the island. Aramis darted out of the grotto, followed by Porthos. Dawn just tinted with purple and white the waves and plain; through the dim light, melancholy fir trees waved their tender branches over the pebbles, and long flights of crows were skimming with their black wings the shimmering fields of buckwheat. In a quarter of an hour it would be clear daylight; the wakened birds announced it to all nature. The barkings which had been heard, which had stopped the three fishermen engaged in moving the boat, and had brought Aramis and Porthos out of the cavern, now seemed to come from a deep gorge within about a league of the grotto.
"It is a pack of hounds," said Porthos. "The dogs are on a scent."
"Who can be hunting at such a moment as this?" said Aramis.
"And this way particularly," continued Porthos, "where they might expect the army of the royalists."
"The noise comes nearer. Yes, you are right, Porthos, the dogs are on a scent.
But Yves," cried Aramis, "come here, come here."
Yves ran toward him, letting fall the cylinder which he was about to place under the boat when the bishop's call interrupted him.
"What is the meaning of this hunt, skipper?" said Porthos.
"Eh? Monseigneur, I cannot understand it," replied the Breton. "It is not at such a moment that the Seigneur de Locmaria would hunt. No, and yet the dogs "
"Unless they have escaped from the kennel."
"No," said Goenne, "they are not the Seigneur de Locmaria's hounds." "In common prudence," said Aramis, "let us go back into the grotto. The voices evidently draw nearer. We shall soon know what we have to trust to." They re entered, but had scarcely proceeded 100 steps in the darkness, when a noise like the hoarse sigh of a creature in distress resounded through the cavern, and breathless, rapid, terrified, a fox passed like a flash of lightning before the fugitives, leaped over the boat, and disappeared, leaving behind its sour scent, which was perceptible for several seconds under the low vaults of the cave.
"The fox!"
cried the Bretons, with the glad surprise of born hunters.
"Accursed mischance!" cried the bishop. "Our retreat is discovered." "How so?" said Porthos. "Are you afraid of a fox?"
"Eh? My friend, what do you mean by that? Why do you specify the fox? It is not the fox alone.
Pardieu!
But don't you know, Porthos, that after the foxes come hounds, and after hounds, men?" Porthos hung his head. As though to confirm the words of Aramis, they heard the yelping pack approach with frightful swiftness upon the trail. 6 foxhounds burst at once upon the little heath, with mingling yelps of triumph. "There are the dogs, plain enough," said Aramis, posted on the lookout behind a chink in the rocks. "Now, who are the huntsmen?"
"If it is the Seigneur de Locmaria's," replied the sailor, "he will leave the dogs to hunt the grotto, for he knows them, and will not enter in himself, being quite sure that the fox will come out the other side. It is there he will wait for him."
"It is not the Seigneur de Locmaria who is hunting," replied Aramis, turning pale in spite of his efforts to maintain a placid countenance.
"Who is it, then?"
said Porthos.
"Look."
Porthos applied his eye to the slit, and saw at the summit of a hillock a dozen horsemen urging on their horses in the track of the dogs, shouting, "Taillot! Taillot!" "The guards!" said he. "Yes, my friend, the king's guards."
"The king's guards, do you say, monseigneur?" cried the Bretons, growing pale in turn.
"With Biscarrat at their head, mounted upon my gray horse," continued Aramis. The hounds at the same moment rushed into the grotto like an avalanche, and the depths of the cavern were filled with their deafening cries. "Ah, the devil!" said Aramis, resuming all his coolness at the sight of this certain, inevitable danger. "I am perfectly satisfied we are lost, but we have at least one chance left. If the guards who follow their hounds happen to discover there is an issue to the grotto, there is no help for us, for on entering they must see both ourselves and our boat. The dogs must not go out of the cavern. Their masters must not enter."
"That is clear,"
said Porthos. "You understand," added Aramis, with the rapid precision of command. "There are 6 dogs that will be forced to stop at the great stone under which the fox has glided, but at the too narrow opening of which they must be themselves stopped and killed." The Bretons sprang forward, knife in hand. In a few minutes there was a lamentable concert of angry barks and mortal howls, and then silence. "That's well," said Aramis, coolly. "Now for the masters."
"What is to be done with them?"
said Porthos. "Wait their arrival, conceal ourselves, and kill them."
"Kill them!"
replied Porthos. "There are 16," said Aramis, "at least at present." "And well armed," added Porthos, with a smile of consolation. "It will last about 10 minutes," said Aramis. "To work!" And with a resolute air he took up a musket and placed a hunting knife between his teeth. "Yves, Goenne, and his son," continued Aramis, "will pass the muskets to us. You, Porthos, will fire when they are close. We shall have brought down, at the lowest computation, 8 before the others are aware of anything. That is certain. Then all, there are 5 of us, will dispatch the other 8, knife in hand."
"And poor Biscarrat?"
said Porthos. Aramis reflected a moment. "Biscarrat first," replied he, coolly. "He knows us." End of chapter.